For this lecture, we'll talk about regulation of body fluids and later on acid-base balance. Now, typically 60% of our body weight is water. So for example, if you have a 70-kilogram man, he would have 42 liters of water. Now, this water is divided into the different compartments in the body. 40% is located in the intracellular compartment. 20% is found in the extracellular compartment. Now, this extracellular fluid is further divided into the interstitial fluid and plasma. Now, there's a special compartment which contains transcellular fluid. Now, this is also termed the third space. So examples of your third space would be your synovial fluid, your pleural fluid, peritoneal fluid, pericardial fluid, and your cerebrospinal fluid. So collectively, they total around 1 to 2 liters. So the purpose of this fluid is to provide cushion and provide some lubrication for the various organs. Now, blood is a special compartment because it contains both intracellular and extracellular fluid. Now, normally 7% of our body weight would be the blood volume. Of course, this is composed of plasma and the formed elements. So 60% of blood is plasma, and the formed elements, which is around 40%, is reflective of the hematocrit. Now, in order to maintain homeostasis for our body fluids, typically intake should equal output. So we have around 2.3 liters of input of water and around 2.3 liters of output. Now, of course, input would vary. So first you have the fluids that we take in. So normally that's around 2.1 liters. And around 200 ml of water would be coming from breakdown of carbohydrates. Now, for our water output, we have several avenues. So first, you have your insensible losses. So this is not readily felt or readily measured. So under this, you have two ways. You have evaporation from the skin, and secondly, you have water losses through respiration. Now, evaporation from the skin may increase under certain conditions, like for example, burns. So when the protective layer of the skin is removed, then water losses can increase through evaporation. For respiration, when we hyperventilate, so water vapor that is lost through respiration would also increase. Water through sweat can also vary depending on our physical activity and environmental temperatures. For the feces, now diarrhea can actually increase our water output through the gastrointestinal tract. And of course, through the urine output is typically 1 to 1.5 liters a day. And this may also vary depending on the hydration status of the body. So looking at the different compartments, so here in this diagram, take note of the different substances present in the extracellular and the intracellular compartment. So in the extracellular compartment, so primarily you have sodium and chloride with the highest concentration. So take note or recall that sodium is the ion that will determine extracellular fluid volume. Intracellularly, here are your different substances. So mainly you have potassium, your phosphate and other organic anions, and of course intracellular proteins. So these are the substances that would have the highest concentrations intracellularly. The blue line here will represent the cell membrane. So the cell membrane now would regulate the flux of water going through in and out of the cell. Now, of course, if you will recall, ions will not readily pass through your cell membrane. So the flux of your ions, no, will have to be regulated by various channels and pumps. But for this lecture, we'll focus more on your ions, no, staying in their respective compartments. Now in this diagram, so this will represent the extracellular fluid. This would be your plasma, and this would be the interstitial fluid. So separating the two would be your capillary endothelial membrane or capillary wall. So take note that in the plasma, you have plasma proteins, and your plasma proteins will not be allowed to pass through the capillary membrane. Because of this, since your plasma proteins would carry negative charges, the Gibbs-Donnan effect will be observed. So in the plasma, you have slightly more cations, and the interstitial fluid, you have slightly more anions. So if you look at this table, so here are the different substances, no, present in the body and in their respective compartments. So you have your plasma, your interstitial compartment, and the intracellular compartment. So take note that those highlighted in red are mainly located extracellularly. Those highlighted in purple, they are mainly located intracellularly. Now, if you look at the total smolar concentration, all three compartments would have almost the same concentrations. Now let's look at how these compartments are measured. So we use the indicator dilution principle. So for example, if you have a container here and you want to measure the volume of the fluid, what we use is an indicator. Now this indicator would have a known concentration and a known volume. So for example, let's say your indicator is 1 ml with a concentration of 10 milligrams per ml. So you administer that into the volume you want to measure and you allow it to go steady state. And then after a while, you get the concentration. So for example, let's say the concentration would be 0.01 milligram per ml. So using your indicator dilution principle, you can actually calculate for the volume of your fluid. So in this case, that would be 1 liter. Now this principle can be used in order to measure the different compartments in the body. But keep in mind that in order to accurately measure these compartments, the appropriate indicator must be utilized. Now you have several criteria with which your indicator should follow so that you would be able to accurately measure the volume of your compartment. Now, first, your indicator should remain within the compartment you want to measure. So for example, sodium and inulin would measure the extracellular fluid volume because they primarily stay there and they do not enter the intracellular compartment. So that's the first criterion. It should stay within the compartment you want to measure. Secondly, your indicator should be evenly distributed to the compartment you want to measure or within the compartment you want to measure, such that you should be able to, or you would be able to accurately calculate for your volume. And the third criterion is that your indicator should not be metabolized, no, in the compartment you want to measure. So these are the three important criteria with which you would follow in order to use the appropriate indicator. So with that, you can use your indicator dilution principle. Now, as what we've mentioned before, certain factors can affect the flux of water or the exchange of water between compartments. So looking at the plasma and the interstitial fluid volumes, since they are limited by the capillary membrane, the main regulator for the exchange of fluid between these two compartments would be the Starling forces. So you have your hydrostatic pressure and your oncotic pressure. Now, of the four Starling forces, your plasma oncotic pressure is the main determinant in the flux of water, no, or the exchange of fluid between the plasma and the interstitial space. Now, for the exchange of water between the extracellular and the intracellular space, this is due to the osmotic effects of solutes, primarily sodium. So take note that the cell membrane is responsible in limiting the flux of these substances. No? So sodium now is the main determinant that will determine your extracellular fluid volume. And take note that all of your compartments should be isotonic with one another. So your intracellular compartment is said to be isotonic with your extracellular compartment. Okay, so having said that, let's review the principle of osmosis and osmotic pressure. So when we talk of osmotic pressure, again, this is the pressure required to prevent osmosis. And osmosis is the flux of water or the movement of water from an area of low concentration to an area of high concentration. And this is dependent on the number of osmotically active particles. No? So for example, you have 1 mole per liter of glucose, sodium chloride, and your sodium sulfate. The greater the number of your osmotically active particles, the greater your osmotic pressure would be. So that would give you a higher osmotic potential or a greater ability to attract water. So comparing the three, sodium sulfate, since in solution, it will dissociate into 2 sodium ions and 1 sulfate ion. You will have 3 osmotically active particles, so it will exert the greatest osmotic pressure, no? Comparing that to sodium chloride or glucose. Now, when we talk of osmolality, this is your osmoles per kilogram of water. Your osmolarity is osmoles per liter of water. Now, strictly speaking, osmolality is said to be more constant because this is dependent on the mass of your fluid, whereas osmolarity is dependent on the volume of your fluid. Now, the volume of water is dependent on temperature, such that if you increase the temperature of water, the volume increases. Unlike mass, if you increase the temperature of water, no, the mass of the water stays the same. So between the two, osmolality is said to be more constant. However, in the human body, we typically use the term osmolarity because since our body temperature does not drastically increase in such a way that it would alter the volume of water in our body, so if you read medical books, we typically use the term osmolarity. So again, when we talk of osmotic pressure, no, this is the pressure that is required to oppose osmosis, and this is dependent or directly proportional to the number of osmotically active particles. So again, sodium sulfate would have a greater osmotic pressure compared to sodium chloride, compared to albumin and glucose. Now take note that osmotic pressure is not dependent on the size of the particle, such that if you have the same concentration of albumin and glucose, they will exert the same osmotic pressure, even though albumin is a bigger molecule. So in calculating for your osmotic pressure, we use the Van Hoff's law. And take note, The greater the concentration of your solutes, the greater the osmotic pressure. And 1 milliosmol per liter will exert around 19.3 millimeters mercury pressure. So how do we now calculate your osmotic pressure given a particular solution? So for example, let's say you have NSS. So that's 0.9% sodium chloride. So what would be its osmotic pressure? So in order to solve for that, your 0.9% sodium chloride is your 9 grams of sodium chloride per 100 ml, or this is also 9 grams per liter. So 9 grams per liter, you divide that by the molecular weight of sodium chloride. So you will get 0.154 moles per liter. Since in solution, sodium chloride dissociates into 2 ions. You have sodium and chloride, so you multiply that by 2. So if your particles dissociate into 3, so you multiply that by 3. So in this case, for sodium chloride, since it will only dissociate into 2 particles, you multiply that by 2. So you will get 0.308 osmoles per liter, or that is also 308 milliosmoles per liter. So to get the pressure, you simply multiply that by 19.3 millimeters mercury. So you'll have a total of 5,944 millimeters mercury. Now, there is a correction factor. So you need to take into account also the osmotic coefficient of your substance. Because in solution, no, although your sodium chloride will dissociate, some of your sodium will still have ionic attraction with chloride. So not all of them will dissociate as sodium and chloride. Some of them will still exist as sodium chloride. So the correction factor for your sodium chloride is 0.93, meaning to say 93% of sodium chloride will dissociate as sodium and chloride. And 0.07 no, would stay as sodium chloride. So using your correction factor, so that would be 308. You multiply that by 0.93, you'll get 286 milliosmoles. So this is the one that you will multiply with 19.3 here. So that's 286 milliosmoles multiplied by 19.3. So this is the corrected osmotic pressure now of your NSS. So looking at your plasma, your interstitial compartment, and the intracellular compartment. So in this table, this is your total osmolar concentration for the 3 compartments. But of course, you have to take into account the correction factor. So this is now your corrected osmolar activity. So you will notice in all 3 compartments, they're almost the same with a slightly higher osmolar activity in the plasma. This is primarily due to your plasma proteins. So in order to get your osmotic pressure, you simply multiply that by 19.3. So here in this table, you will take note the osmotic pressure within the 3 compartments. Okay, now talking about the fluids that we use in the hospital. So first, you have your isotonic solution. So when we speak of isotonic solutions, many medical students would have this misconception that these solutions would have the same concentration as plasma. It's actually not true. So when we speak of isotonic solutions, this means that the fluid has the same osmotic potential as plasma, not the same concentration. So for example, when you have 0.9 sodium chloride, it would have the same osmotic potential as your plasma, meaning it has the same ability to attract water. but it will not have the same concentration as plasma. So NSS would contain 0.9% sodium and 0.9% chloride, whereas plasma would contain sodium, chloride, potassium, magnesium, calcium, etc. So you have other substances that are present in your plasma. The same is true for your lactated Ringer's solution. So these are your isotonic fluids. So when we speak of hypotonic solutions, these are solutions with osmotic potentials that are less than plasma, meaning it has a higher concentration or higher amounts of water compared to plasma. When we speak of hypertonic solutions, of course, as the name implies, it would have lesser amounts of water compared to plasma. So these fluids, your hypertonic, isotonic, and hypotonic solutions, when infused in a patient, this can affect the volume and concentrations of your fluid compartments. So in the clinics, we keep in mind the behavior of these fluids because these can drastically affect fluid homeostasis of our patients. Now let's look at effective circulating volume. Now take note that your extracellular fluid volume is dependent on sodium. Now your extracellular fluid volume again is further divided into the plasma and the interstitial compartment. Now it doesn't necessarily mean that if you have a high extracellular fluid volume, this means that the different organs will have adequate perfusion. So with that, the term effective circulating volume is coined. No? Your effective circulating volume reflects the amount of plasma or blood that is distributed to the different organs. So there are certain conditions that effective circulating volume may be low in spite of an increase in extracellular fluid volume. An example of this would be congestive heart failure. So for example, in long-standing congestive heart failure, there is accumulation of fluid. So the patient might experience edema and the heart does not effectively pump blood. So with that, because of renal compensations, extracellular fluid volume increases. However, the effective circulating volume may go down. Now, this effective circulating volume is regulated or monitored by various pressure sensors in the body. So we have four. We have your low pressure volume sensors, your high pressure volume sensors, sensors present in the kidneys, in the lungs. Sensors present in the liver and in the central nervous system. Okay, first let's look at your low pressure volume sensors. So they are located primarily in the atria and your pulmonary vessels. When atrial filling and your pulmonary vessels or the filling decreases, this will activate the sympathetics and this will potentiate ADH release. So at the end of the day, there would be an increase in volume because of reabsorption of sodium and water. On the opposite end, of course, when filling in these structures would increase, then the opposite happens. So you have decreased sympathetics, and increased release of your natriuretic peptides. So you will now promote excretion of water. So volume drops. So this or these low pressure volume sensors typically detect 5 to 10% change in the pressure. Another is your high pressure volume sensors. Now, between the two, the high pressure volume sensors is most widely studied. So this is the baroreceptor reflex. So they are basically detected in the aortic and carotid sinus and also in the afferent arterioles in the kidneys. So for example, when blood pressure increases, so that will activate your baroreceptor reflex. So that will attenuate your sympathetic and your parasympathetics will predominate. Of course, when the opposite happens, when pressure drops, no, your sympathetics will be activated. That will potentiate release of your ATH. And in the kidneys, renal blood flow will go down. So that will activate your JJ apparatus, increasing now RAAS. So both RAAS and ADH will reabsorb sodium and water. And your high pressure volume sensors would also typically detect 5 to 10% change in your pressure. Your hepatic sensors and in the central nervous system, they contain sodium sensors. So once, let's say for example, in the liver, so here, when volume or sodium concentration increases, this will decrease sympathetic activity. And in the CNS, when CSF sodium or carotid pressure increases, so that will promote a release of your natriuretic peptides and a decrease in your angiotensin 2. So with that, that will promote sodium excretion. So volume goes down. So during volume expansion, expect sodium excretion since sodium determines extracellular fluid volume. So with that, you decrease your sympathetic effects, you promote natriuresis, and you decrease ADH and RAAS activation. Of course, when you have volume contraction, expect sodium reabsorption to happen. So the opposite occurs. Okay, now let's look at changes in the volume and osmolarities under pathologic conditions. Now, typically, the changes in our fluid volumes and osmolarities is greatly affected by the input and output of water and solutes. So for example, if you have too much ingestion or too much infusion of IV fluid, so that could potentially alter fluid volume and the concentrations of your electrolytes. No? So other conditions, you have renal problems. So for example, renal pathologies can increase fluid volume and increase concentrations of your substances. Dehydration can decrease your fluid volume and increase solute concentration. Sweating and GI losses would also affect volume and osmolarities. Now, in managing these patients, keep in mind that the type of fluid that we use is important. And take note also that water would readily move across membranes. And take note also that the cell membrane will not allow these solutes to pass through. So having said that, let's say this is your steady state, no, or the normal state. So this is your intracellular compartment. This is the extracellular compartment. This is your volume plotted against osmolarity. So let's say if you give an isotonic fluid, this would be your result, no? Such that if you look at the tonicity of both extra and intracellular compartments, they would stay the same. The volume of your intracellular compartment would also stay the same, but the volume of your extracellular fluid increases. adding a hypotonic solution that would decrease both intra and extracellular fluid osmolarities. So their osmolarities would go down, meaning they would be more diluted. And the volumes of both compartments would increase. So this is the volume of the intracellular space and the volume of your extracellular space. So take note that water readily enters the cell membrane, increasing now the volume of your intracellular compartment. If you infuse a hypertonic solution, however, take note that the tonicities of both compartments would increase intracellularly and extracellularly. But the volume of your intracellular space would go down because the hypertonic solution would attract water. Water inside the cell would go out. So your intracellular volume decreases, whereas your extracellular fluid volume would increase. Now, certain substances can readily cross your cell membrane, like for example, glucose and amino acids. So when administering IV fluids to our patients, we keep in mind how these substances would be handled by the cell membrane. So for example, for glucose and amino acids, since they readily cross the cell membrane, these are ineffective osmoles. No, they are not able to, or they do not exert osmotic pressure as good as, let's say, sodium. And these solutions must be adjusted to isotonicity and they must be administered slowly. So for example, when you have D5 water, so D5 water is said to be isoosmotic. No? Many students would have this misconception that D5 water is isotonic. It is not isotonic. It is isoosmotic. Because glucose, unlike sodium, glucose enters the cell. And when glucose enters the cell, this will make your fluid hypotonic. No? So when giving your D5 water, it must be administered slowly. No? Or you could add it to other IV fluids and adjust it to isotonicity. So take note that the excess water must be excreted by the body. Okay, since sodium is the main determinant for your extracellular fluid volume, so changes in your sodium concentration can actually produce certain pathologies. So first, let's look at hyponatremia. So when we speak of hyponatremia, of course, sodium concentration falls below normal. Now, when you have hyponatremia, we have risk of developing cellular edema. Now, under hyponatremia, you have two types. You have your hyponatremic dehydration and your hyponatremic overhydration. So as the name implies, when we speak of dehydration, other than a decrease in sodium because of your hyponatremia, you also have decreased water content in the body. And here are a few examples. For your hypoosmotic overhydration, so sodium concentration is low, but water content in the body is high. So an example of this would be your SIADH. So this would present with dilutional hyponatremia. Now, your hyponatremia is primarily due to a decrease in sodium intake or an increase in your water intake. For your hypernatremia, cells would typically shrink. Since sodium cannot readily enter the cell, sodium will exert its osmotic potential, thus water inside the cell would go out. So that would produce shrinking of your cell. So under this, you have two conditions as well. You have your hyperosmotic dehydration and your hypoosmotic overhydration. So again, as the name implies, when we say dehydration, there is less water content in the body. When we say overhydration, there is increased water content in the body. Now, when we talk of hypernatremia, this is primarily due to water losses. So that will increase your sodium content in the body. Or there is increased sodium intake. So here are a few examples. So when when there are changes in your sodium concentration, so you can either observe cell shrinking or cell swelling. Now, when the changes are drastic, then it would be detrimental to the body. No? When there is rapid or sudden changes in sodium concentration, no? Sudden increase or a sudden decrease. However, if the changes in your sodium concentration occurs gradually, so it gives time for the cells to mount a defense that would protect itself from the detrimental effects of changes in sodium concentration. So for example, when extracellular sodium concentration gradually increases, so because of osmosis, cells would shrink. So the volume of your cell would go down. The cells would activate the regulatory volume increase response. No? So what's happening is that the cells, its cytoskeleton would detect the degree of shrinking. So when that happens, the cells would now increase intracellular osmolytes. No? So as your osmolytes would increase, so for example, you have increased production of your myoinositol, sorbitol, no? Glycerophosphorylcholine or betaine, or there is a decreased flux of your electrolytes. So these substances, no, would increase intracellularly, meaning as these substances would increase, they would also affect the flux of water. So water now would be or would go back or would be attracted back into the cell. So that would prevent drastic cell shrinking. If sodium concentration gradually decreases, no, there is a risk of cell swelling because when you have hyponatremia, water in the extracellular space can go inside the cell. So again, because of the swelling, this will be detected again by your cytoskeletons. So that would activate your regulatory volume decrease response. So in this response, there is a decreased production of your osmolytes. So that will now prevent or that will now decrease osmotically active particles inside the cell, preventing now water from entering the cell. Now, in correcting your sodium concentration problems, no? Typically in the hospital, we do it gradually. We do not correct sodium problems rapidly, most especially for hyponatremia. Because if you rapidly correct, let's say hyponatremia, this can result to your osmotic demyelinization syndrome. So because of the drastic increase in your extracellular sodium concentration, no, you do not have time to regulate your intracellular osmolytes. So that can affect your myelin sheath. No? So that will result to your osmotic demyelinization syndrome. Okay, now let's talk about edema. So when we talk about edema, this is simply the accumulation of fluid, no, in the compartments. So if it occurs or if it accumulates intracellularly, so you have intracellular edema. So these are the conditions that would produce your intracellular swelling. Now, intracellular edema do not typically present as pitting edema. Usually, pitting edema, no, is an example of your extracellular edema. So here you have accumulation of fluid in the interstitial space. No? So again, your pitting edema is typically your extracellular edema, whereas your non-pitting edema is your intracellular edema. So let's look at extracellular edema more closely. So recall now the formula for your filtration rate. So your filtration rate is equal to your filtration coefficient multiplied by your effective filtering pressure. And again, your effective filtering pressure would be your Starling forces. So these are your pro-filtering factors minus your anti-filtering factors. Now, the factors that will result to edema are highlighted in red. So any problems in one or more of these factors can result to edema. No? So for example, if you have changes in your filtration coefficient, or if your filtration coefficient increases, no, then edema happens. The same is true for your capillary hydrostatic pressure. If you have lymphatic blockade, no, or lymphedema, so that's your lymphatic drainage, or when you have decreased plasma oncotic pressure, then that would affect, no, or that would also result to edema. So that's a drop in your capillary oncotic pressure. So here are a few examples of conditions wherein edema is observed. So take note, here are your factors. So this is your KF. This is your increased hydrostatic pressure. This is your decreased oncotic pressure. This is your KF, no? Increased capillary permeability. And of course, blockage of your lymphatic vessels. So take note that some disease conditions can fall under more than one categories. Like for example, burns. No? So you have decreased plasma proteins because when you damage your blood vessels, plasma proteins can leak out. In the same manner, damaging your blood vessels, no, you increase your capillary permeability. So some disease conditions, no, or some edematous conditions can fall under more than one category. But the body has ways to prevent edema. So you have three factors to do that. You have the low compliance of the interstitium, increased lymphatic flow, and the washdown of interstitial proteins. So under low compliance of the interstitium, first you have the negative pressure. So take note that the interstitium would have -3 millimeters mercury. So that's the pressure in the interstitium. For as long as the pressure is in the negative side, no, small changes in fluid volume are associated with increased or large changes in interstitial hydrostatic pressure. Meaning to say, the slightest increase in your fluid volume, no, which typically is around 12 liters, the slightest increase will already drastically increase the interstitial hydrostatic pressure. And if you will recall your equation for filtration, increasing your interstitial hydrostatic pressure will prevent, no, water from going into the interstitial space. So this negative pressure acting as a vacuum will give a low compliance, meaning to say the interstitial space, no, is not easily expandable or expansible. The second factor is your interstitial gel. So your gel prevents the flow of your fluid and it will offer some resistance. So this is your compact brush pile, no? And your because of this, your interstitial fluid volume will not change greatly. So together with your interstitial gel, you also have your proteoglycan filaments. So they now, your proteoglycan filaments act as spacers. They modulate the flow of the fluid, and together with that, you have your nutrients and metabolites. No? So these are the reasons why, for example, when we stand up, fluid and substances in the upper portions of the body do not readily go down to the more dependent portions of the body. So this is due to the low compliance of your interstitium. So again, take note, the pressure should be negative. If it becomes zero or if it becomes positive, the compliance increases. Meaning your brush piles are pulled apart, so you now have space, and this space will now be occupied by water. So with that, edema happens. The second factor that will prevent edema is your increased lymph flow. So for example, when fluid in the interstitial space increases, then lymphatic drainage would also increase. So this will bring the fluid back to your general circulation. No? So an increase in your filtered fluid increases your interstitial hydrostatic pressure. That will increase your lymphatic flow. So that will provide around 7 millimeters mercury safety factor. The third is the washdown of interstitial proteins. So take note that proteins will exert osmotic potential. So for example, when interstitial fluid proteins are present, then they are handled by the lymphatics. So the lymphatic system will drain these proteins and bring them back to the general circulation. So that decreases now your interstitial oncotic pressure. So that will prevent your edema. No? So that will offer another 7 millimeters mercury pressure. So all in all, you have the three components, no? Or the three factors that will prevent edema: low compliance of the interstitium, offering around 3 millimeters mercury safety factor; increased lymph flow, that's 7 millimeters mercury; and wash down of your interstitial proteins, so that's 7 millimeters mercury. So you now have a total of 17 millimeters mercury. So meaning to say, in order for edema to happen, you need to have an increase of 17 millimeters mercury capillary pressure or more in order for edema to happen. For fluids in the potential spaces, so again, these are your specialized compartments or your third space. So you have your pleural cavity, peritoneal cavity, pericardial cavity, your synovial cavity, etc. No? Now, the fluid within these compartments, they behave like the fluid in the interstitial space. So you have also exchange of water between the capillaries and the potential space. And of course, your lymphatics will also handle excess fluids. And take note also that these compartments would have negative pressure, no? Such that if the pressures would increase, then the fluid in these compartments would accumulate. So for example, in the thorax, you have pleural effusion. In the abdomen, you have ascites. In the heart, no, or in the pericardial sac, you have your cardiac tamponade. Now let's talk about acid-base balance. So to get the pH of the body, we simply get the negative log of the hydrogen ion concentration. So here, the negative log of 0.00000004 milliequivalents per liter. So that's 7.4. So this is now the pH of the body. Now keep in mind that in the hospital, this is the normal range we use. No? However, if you look at the different compartments in the body, pH varies. So it could be as low as, let's say, 0.8 in the stomach, or it could be as high as 8 alkaline in the urine. But of course, the normal pH of plasma ranges from 7.35 to 7.45. So as a review, when we say acid, this will release a hydrogen ion. When we speak of a base, this will accept a proton or a hydrogen ion. So if you look at this equation, your carbonic acid is your acid because it will give off its hydrogen ion. Your bicarb is your base, no, because it will accept your hydrogen ion. So take note that this reaction is reversible. So in order to maintain acid-base balance, you have three regulators. You have your buffer systems, the lungs, and the kidneys. Now, among the three, no, when pH in the body changes, the first to react would be the chemical buffer system. So acting instantaneously to a few seconds, the buffer system will try to bring the pH back to normal or mitigate the changes in pH. Occurring within a few minutes to hours would be the lungs. Occurring within a few days, no, around 3 to 5 days, you have the kidneys. So take note that the kidneys would require longer time in correcting pH. However, among the three, it is the kidneys that are the most important, no, controller for our pH. Second to that would be the lungs. Third is the buffer. So the buffer systems are not good regulators for pH. The kidneys, because they are able to handle a wide variety of acids and bases, no, they are the main organs for controlling our pH. Okay, so let's look at these control systems more closely. So first, you have your buffers. So for your buffers, you have your intracellular buffers and your extracellular buffers. So for your intracellular buffers, you have your bicarb, your phosphate, and of course, your intracellular proteins. So for example, in this slide, your hydrogen here can bind to hemoglobin. So hemoglobin here can now act as a buffer, neutralizing now your hydrogen ion. Now your intracellular proteins would have a pK of 7.4. So this is the dissociation constant for your 7.4. For your extracellular buffers, no, we mainly have your bicarb and your phosphate buffer systems. So here, your buffer can get your hydrogen ion, so that will now neutralize your hydrogen ion. So let's look at your bicarb buffer system first. So I'm sure you are familiar with this reaction. So carbon dioxide plus water, you produce your carbonic acid, no? With the aid of your carbonic anhydrase. It will dissociate into your hydrogen ion and your bicarb. Bicarb in the plasma will combine with sodium. No? So you now have sodium bicarb. So acting as a buffer now, let's say if you increase your acids, let's say you produce or you add lactic acid, so that will increase your hydrogen ion concentration. So this will shift your reaction to the reactant side, neutralizing your acid now and giving rise to carbon dioxide and water. In the same manner, if you have an alkali or a base, let's say sodium hydroxide, it will shift your reaction to the product side. No? So your hydroxyl ion here will be neutralized by your hydrogen ion. So you now produce water. And your sodium here will bind with your bicarb. So you produce now sodium bicarb. So that's how your bicarb buffer system would work. No? So this is your Henderson-Hasselbalch equation. No? So in the laboratory, this is the equation on how we will be computing for the pH. So take note, you only need two factors. So you have the concentration of your bicarb and your PCO2. Both of these parameters are determined by your arterial blood gas. Now, looking at the pK of your bicarb buffer system, so the pK or your dissociation constant is around 6.1, meaning to say at the pH of 6.1, you have an equal concentration of your protonated and unprotonated species. So you have a 50-50 concentration of your carbonic acid and your bicarb at 6.1. Now, if you will review your biochemistry, your pK, this is where maximum buffering capacity happens. It will bring the pH of your fluid to its pK value. So any changes in the pH, your bicarb buffer system will try to bring the pH to 6.1. If you will notice, 7.4 is the normal pH of the body. So this will show to us that the bicarb buffer system is not a good regulator for our pH, because the bicarb buffer system brings the pH to its pK value. That is 6.1. It is not able to bring the pH to 7.4. So this is the reason why your buffer systems are the weakest regulators for pH. For your phosphate buffer system, so they are important as intracellular buffers, or they act as buffers in the renal tubules. So this is your simple equation. So when you add, let's say, hydrochloric acid, it will combine with your Na2HPO4, neutralizing your hydrogen, giving rise to your NaH2PO4 and sodium chloride. When you add a base, no, let's say sodium hydroxide, it will now interact with your NaH2PO4, neutralizing your hydroxyl ion. No, it will combine with your hydrogen to produce water and Na2HPO4. So again, take note the pK value of your phosphate buffer system is 6.8, meaning it will try to bring the pH at 6.8, not at 7.4. So again, this is the reason why the buffer systems are weak regulators for our pH. So this is your isohydric principle. So the hydrogen ion concentration, or the total hydrogen ion in our body, is dependent on the different buffer systems. So for example, let's say this will represent one buffer system. Let's say your bicarb buffer system. This is your phosphate. This would be your citrate, etc. down the line. So any changes in one of these systems, no, all of your systems will have to adjust in order to regulate your hydrogen ion concentration. No? So all of them will have to adjust simultaneously. Okay. The second regulator for our pH would be the lungs. So if you will recall your lecture in basic pulmonology or respiratory physiology, the lungs primarily handle carbonic acid. So this is your volatile acid. No? And we all know that the amount of carbonic acid in the body is directly proportional to the amount of carbon dioxide present in the body. No? So that the lungs modulates the amount of carbon dioxide, no? Or it controls your PCO2. And it is not 100% effective. So it is only 50 to 75% effective on its own. No? It will have to need the activity of your buffers and your kidneys in order for the lungs to bring the pH back to normal. No? So by itself, the lungs is not 100% effective. But it is more powerful compared to your chemical buffer systems. Okay, now let's go to the kidneys. Now the kidneys, like what we've mentioned, they are the most important organs that would regulate our pH because they are able to handle a wide variety of acids and bases. Now, in order for us to understand how the kidneys work, take note that the kidneys would have to secrete hydrogen ions and reabsorb bicarb or produce new bicarb. Now, typically, around 4,320 milliequivalents of bicarb is filtered each day. Also, 4,390 milliequivalents of hydrogen ions would be secreted each day. Now, in order to reabsorb bicarb, no, hydrogen must be secreted. No? Hydrogen must be secreted. So if you want to reabsorb one molecule of bicarb, one hydrogen ion must be secreted. So if you look at the values here, no, virtually 100% of your bicarb will be reabsorbed because you have an excess of 70 milliequivalents of hydrogen ions. So all of your bicarb molecules will be reabsorbed. The excess hydrogen ions will now be excreted. So this is the reason why urine typically has a low pH. Okay. So first, let's look at your hydrogen ion hydrogen ion secretion. So if you will recall, in the renal tubules, your proximal convoluted tubule and your loop of Henle and your DCT and collecting ducts, they are able to secrete hydrogen ions, no? And like what we've mentioned, around 4,390 no, milliequivalents are secreted each day. Now, much of this hydrogen ion would be utilized in order to reabsorb your bicarb. No? So again, almost or 100% of your bicarb will be reabsorbed now. The excess will be excreted as your non-volatile acids. So if you look at the diagram here, so this is the relative amount of bicarb being reabsorbed in the different segments of the nephron. So keep in mind that every time your bicarb is reabsorbed, hydrogen must be secreted. No? Okay. So how does that happen? So let's look at the diagram here. So let's say this is the blood, this is the filtrate, this is your tubular cell. Okay, so this is now a filtered bicarb. No? So how do we now reabsorb bicarb? So starting with your cell, so this is your carbon dioxide combining with water. So you now produce your carbonic acid. Your carbonic acid dissociates into your bicarb and your hydrogen ion. So take note, your hydrogen ion here will have to be secreted out into the filtrate. Your hydrogen ion will combine with a filtered bicarb, reconstituting now carbonic acid. So in the filtrate, no, with the action of your carbonic anhydrase, you will reconstitute water and carbon dioxide now. And again, carbon dioxide can easily enter the tubular cell. And the same reaction happens. So with that, you form again your carbonic acid, and then carbonic acid dissociates into your bicarb and your hydrogen ion. Looking at your bicarb here now, your bicarb now is transported into the blood, no, via a sodium bicarb syn-porter or a bicarb or chloride bicarb counter transport. No? So take note that you filter one bicarb, no? You add one bicarb into the system. Now this filtered bicarb must combine with your hydrogen ion in order to reconstitute carbon dioxide that will undergo these reactions in order to form this bicarb. If your bicarb in the filtrate does not interact with your hydrogen, your bicarb is simply excreted. No? It is simply excreted. So the reaction inside the tubular cell will not happen. So there will be no reabsorption of your bicarb. So take note that there is no net gain. One bicarb is filtered, one bicarb is reabsorbed. So you just maintain status quo. So that's how your bicarb is being reabsorbed. So again, in order to reabsorb one bicarb molecule, hydrogen must be secreted. Now, here you have your intercalated cells. Again, you have two types of intercalated cells. You have your alpha and your beta intercalated cell. So this is your alpha intercalated cell. No? Its purpose is to secrete hydrogen ions. So it secretes hydrogen ions out into the filtrate. Your bicarb now, your beta intercalated cell will secrete your bicarb here into the filtrate, no? Such that when you have acidosis, your alpha intercalated cell would increase its activity in order to secrete more hydrogen ions. You excrete more hydrogen ions. So when you have acidosis, of course, the body will have to eliminate excess acids. Similarly, when you have alkalosis, you increase the activity of your beta intercalated cells. So you increase secretion of your bicarb. You excrete now an alkaline urine. No? So when you have alkalosis, you need to eliminate excess bicarb from the body. Okay. So let's look at another factor. In this slide, we will take note how a new bicarb is added into the system. So we'll start with carbon dioxide, combines with water, you form your carbonic acid. Your carbonic acid dissociates into your bicarb and your hydrogen ion. Your hydrogen ion is pumped out and your bicarb is transported into the blood. But take note, your hydrogen ion, instead of combining with a filtered bicarb, it will combine with a non-bicarb buffer. In this case, this is a phosphate buffer. So once your phosphate buffer gets your hydrogen ion, it will now be excreted. What is the effect? The effect is there is a net gain of your bicarb. No? There's a net gain of your bicarb. So the rule is, if your hydrogen ion binds with a bicarb buffer, this bicarb is simply reabsorbed. There is no net gain, status quo remains. If your hydrogen ion combines with a non-bicarb buffer, in this case, a phosphate buffer, or an ammonia, or urate, or citrate, for as long as your hydrogen combines with a non-bicarb buffer, this is simply excreted. You add a new bicarb into the body. So there is addition of new bicarb. Now, looking at the effect of aldosterone, recall that aldosterone increases the activity of your sodium-potassium pump. And increasing the activity of your sodium-potassium pump increases the activity of your secondary pump. So in this case, this is your sodium-hydrogen countertransport. No? So when hydrogen is being secreted, it can combine with a non-bicarb buffer. What you're essentially doing is you're adding new bicarb into the system or into the body. That's why when you have hyperaldosteronism, alkalosis happens. For your ammonia, so of course ammonia is a metabolite. This would come from the metabolism of your amino acid, so it can easily cross cell membranes. So this is a hydrogen ion being secreted again. So take note, your hydrogen ion combines with a non-bicarb buffer. No? It combines with ammonia, forming now ammonium, and it will combine with chloride. So you now have ammonium chloride that will be excreted. So again, hydrogen combines with a non-bicarb buffer. Therefore, you add a new bicarb into the system. So that's additional bicarb for the body. So looking at the handling of ammonia now, so typically you have glutamine when metabolized during acidosis, so you produce more ammonia, which can easily pass through cell membranes. No? So in the filtrate, it will combine with a secreted hydrogen to form ammonium, no? And then eventually ammonium chloride, which is then excreted. No? So take note that when you have ammonium, no, since it is already charged or it is positively charged, it will no longer be able to pass through the cell membranes. So ammonium now will be excreted, no, together with the hydrogen that has been secreted. So during acidosis, these processes will increase. So that will produce an acidic urine. Again, during acidosis, your amino acids may be metabolized. So in this case, it's glutamine. Glutamine will be metabolized by the tubular cells. This time, it will produce 2 moles of your ammonium and 2 moles of your bicarb. So when glutamine is being metabolized, you add a new bicarb into the system, no? And you excrete more hydrogen ions. So this process is also accelerated during acidosis. Again, recall that when secreted hydrogen combines with your bicarb, this is simply reabsorbed. When a hydrogen ion combines with a non-bicarb buffer, you produce a new bicarb. No? So during acidosis, you have excess hydrogen ions. Virtually 100% of your bicarb is reabsorbed, and you produce new bicarb. So always recall that when you have acid-base disorders, you would have to eliminate what is in excess. So if you have acidosis, you would have to eliminate excess hydrogen ions. If you have alkalosis, you would have to eliminate excess bicarb. No? So these are the stimuli for the secretion of your hydrogen ions. So when carbon dioxide increases, when you have acidosis or extracellular pH drops, or when you have excess aldosterone. So when you have acidosis, since you have more hydrogen ions present in the body, so you have a gradient that will favor secretion of your hydrogen into your filtrate. No? You also have allosteric changes in your transport protein. So some proteins, since it act as, or they will act as your buffers, no? They can neutralize your hydrogen ions. But of course, this is not without consequence. So for example, when calcium is bound to plasma proteins and you have acidosis, your plasma proteins would rather neutralize your hydrogen ions, thus releasing now your calcium. So during acidosis, ionized calcium increases, no? And when you have increased ionized calcium or hypercalcemia, it could produce detrimental effects. You also have regulations of your transporters. So again, depending on the acid-base status, in the case of acidosis, you need to increase secretion of your hydrogen and reabsorption of your bicarb. During volume contraction, hydrogen ion secretion is increased. So these are the different processes that occur. Now, during volume expansion, hydrogen secretion goes down. So the opposite events would happen. Now, in order to quantify acid-base excretion, or if you want to determine the amount of acid being excreted, so you need 3 factors. You have your bicarb excretion, your ammonium excretion, and your titratable acids. No? So this you could easily determine in the lab. So you just get the bicarb concentration of urine or the ammonia concentration in the urine. No? For your titratable acid, so this would be your non-bicarb, non-ammonium buffer being excreted. So this would be coming from your other buffers like your citrate, urate, phosphate, etc. So what we do here is we use sodium hydroxide. So if you will recall your basic chemistry, when you use a burette, no, and you want to determine the amount of acid present in your solution, you utilize sodium hydroxide. So the amount of sodium hydroxide consumed, no, that would neutralize your fluid, this would be reflective of your the amount of acids present. No? So once you have the three variables, so your net acid excretion would be your ammonium plus your titratable acid. So that would be your acids minus your bases. No? So take note that maintaining your acid-base balance, net acid excretion should equal to your non-volatile acid production. So which makes sense. No? So the amount of production should equal to your excretion. If acid excretion increases, then alkalosis could happen. If excretion of acid goes down, then acidosis could happen. No? So here are the conditions wherein acidosis would occur. So here, take note that acid excretion increases and you add new bicarb to the body. For alkalosis, no, opposite effects. So there are no acids being excreted. So take note that during alkalosis, urine pH should increase and no production of new bicarb. So you're familiar with this, no? Classifying simple acid-base disorders. So the first thing that you will look at would be the pH. And then second to that would be your carbon dioxide and your bicarb. So here are the processes that are happening when you have acidosis. So you have more hydrogen ions compared to your bicarb. So expect an acidic urine. So excess hydrogen ion must be removed from the body. No? Virtually 100% of bicarb is reabsorbed and new bicarb is added into the system. No? And of course, the compensation performed by the lungs would be increased ventilation. So you stimulate your respiratory center. For alkalosis, this would be the opposite. So you have excess bicarb. So this excess bicarb must be excreted. So therefore, urine is alkaline or pH is high. No? You retain your hydrogen ions. So no new bicarb is formed. And ventilation decreases. So what the lungs are doing is they're trying to increase carbon dioxide and carbonic acid in the body in order to bring pH back to normal. So again, this is how we diagnose simple acid-base disorders. Get the pH first, then look at your bicarb and your carbon dioxide. Any problems in your bicarb is metabolic in nature. Any problems in carbon dioxide would be respiratory in nature. No? But in the clinics, however, we rarely get simple acid-base disorders. Usually when they come to the hospital, patients would already have complications, no, or mixed acid-base disorders. Now, in order to properly diagnose, no, your mixed acid-base disorders, we use the acid-base nomogram here. No? Now, your acid-base nomogram, we do not immediately use this. So proper history taking must be accounted for, because recall that renal compensation happens within 3 to 5 days. No? So in using your acid-base nomogram, respiratory and renal adjustments should have occurred. So adequate history taking is necessary, in order for us to properly diagnose our patients. So for example, if you have this ABG result, so in order to properly diagnose, since all parameters are deranged, we simply use the acid-base nomogram. So how do we use it? We simply plot the values. So for example, you plot the pH here, your bicarb is 12, and your carbon dioxide is 25. So plotting them in the nomogram, all three values will intersect at metabolic acidosis. No? So management now would focus more on metabolic disorders that would result to acidosis. So here's another example. So again, all of your parameters are deranged. So this is not a simple acid-base disorder. So you use your acid-base nomogram. And again, take note of complete respiratory and renal compensations. So you simply plot. So in this case, this is 7.15. This is 7. This is 50. So if you plot, you will notice you have 2 points. No? You have 2 points. So how do you properly diagnose it? So your main disorder would fall on the yellow region here. So your main disorder would be metabolic acidosis. But do not discount this factor. No? Since this would fall under your PCO2, this is respiratory in nature. So to properly diagnose, you have metabolic acidosis with respiratory component. Meaning to say, your main problem is metabolic in nature, but you should also look into the fact that the lungs are also retaining carbon dioxide. So you should also address that problem. No? Can this disorder be observed in an actual hospital setting? Yes. A classic example would be, let's say, a patient with uncontrolled diabetes. So that's your diabetic ketoacidosis suffering from asthma. No? So that could happen. So this is another example. So if you look at the pH, it's within normal range, but your bicarb and your carbon dioxide parameters are deranged. So this is not normal. So we use the nomogram again, you plot. So 7.4 is here. 30 is here. 60 is there. So again, you plot. So here you have 2 points. So your main problem now in this case is pulmonary in nature. So this is your chronic respiratory acidosis. This is chronic respiratory acidosis. But again, do not discount your metabolic factor. No? So here, your complete diagnosis would be chronic respiratory acidosis with full renal compensation. Meaning to say, because of your respiratory acidosis, the kidneys would have to eliminate excess acids in order to bring the pH back to normal. So is this condition normal? The answer is no. Even though the pH is normal, your patient still has a problem. So you need to address your respiratory problem. So to correct your acidosis. Now, another parameter that we use in the hospital is the anion gap. No? Now, theoretically, the body is neutral or has a neutral charge, meaning the plasma has the same amounts of cations and anions to maintain electrical neutrality. Now, of course, you have various cations and anions present in the plasma or in the body. So typically, your sodium chloride and your bicarb, so these are the ions that are readily measured, no, in the hospital. So to calculate for your anion gap, this is simply your cations minus your anions. So that's your sodium minus your bicarb minus your chloride. No? So that's your cations minus your anions. So theoretically, it should be 0. No? So your cations should equal your anions. So to get your plasma anion gap, we simply get the concentrations of your sodium, bicarb, and chloride. No? So for example, here you have 144 milliequivalents, 24, and 108. So you simply plug in the values, you'll get a value of 10 milliequivalents. So this would be now your anion gap. So typically the normal range for your anion gap is around 8 to 10 milliequivalents, sometimes up to 12, depending on the lab. No? Now, if you have increased anion gap, so there could be certain ions that might come into play. So for example, if you have increased anion gap, looking at it mathematically, maybe you might have more cations present in the body, or you have less anions in the body. So that would increase your anion gap. So here are a few cations and anions. So in getting your anion gap, it is prudent to keep in mind these ions because they will also play an important role in the management of our patients. So for example, if you get an anion gap that is wide, no, or high, but your sodium bicarb and chloride are within normal or your electrolytes are within optimal values, then your unmeasured ions might play a role. So for example, increased cations, like for example, calcium, no? Hypercalcemia can play an important role in the symptomatology of our patients. No? So things like that. Now, in using your anion gap, we typically use this during metabolic acidosis. No? Now, sometimes chloride can increase. No? So, for example, if you get your chloride concentration, so it could increase. Or there is some unmeasured anion that would come into play. So here are a few examples. So again, if you have an increased anion gap, no, it may be due to your unmeasured anions or unmeasured cations. So this would be your differential diagnosis. So for example, if you have your increased anion gap but your chloride levels are normal, so you might want to look into these conditions. If you have a normal anion gap but chloride levels are high, then these are your considerations. Now, in correcting our acid-base disorders, it is important for us to determine the cause of your disorder. So we must correct your underlying disorder. So if we just keep on correcting the pH, then your disorder would return and would cause more complications. No? For alkalosis, we typically use lysyl monohydrochloride. For acidosis, we either use sodium lactate or sodium gluconate.